be your host, Eric Lorenz. And basically, a quick little thing about me. I've been in the games industry for almost 10 years. Graduated from SCAD Savannah in 2014. And yeah, I've just been doing this for a while. Very passionate about game audio and especially, uh, you know, telling up and coming people in the games industry how to kind of utilize game audio the best that they can. So, a couple things on like what to expect. Going to kind of do like a quick game audio overview. It's going to start diving into like the mixing stuff, like bus structure, um, tools for interactive mixing, creation of assets, little things to just like know while you're making things if you're doing it yourself. And then going into the storytelling, breaking it into like two different components, which is like the narrative audio storytelling and emotional audio storytelling, because they're integrated but very different concepts. And then afterwards, QA conversations. Just love to hear from all of you. So, first of all, the main thing to know about game audio is it's all just information. Um, and you can break that into whether it's like story or gameplay information. So, like with the story, you kind of have like narrative elements. So, how your audio can kind of like help inform the what, how, why, and player emotions on how they feel. So, like, for example, narrative elements of like you're in a big cave and you've got like, cave sounds and like water dripping, and even just like that is kind of like, the what of like where we are, like hearing that it's a wet cave. And maybe going into player emotions, you can start bringing in some like tense music or some pleasant music. You got a lot of ways to like um essentially like persuade the player and like how they should feel. And then the other side of it is the gameplay, which is player feedback, game strategy, um, very, normal gamey sort of things where like, if you're taking damage in like a shooter game, like you need to know that. You need to know location of enemies. So like that's kind of like the voice or like sound effects that are coming from there. And then also kind of strategy, which, yeah, right here I said, like, are you about to lose the game? Like, is your health really low? How do you kind of address those things? Or even like a hidden area, like you can put audio to kind of like suggest, like steer a player towards certain areas. And so, you want to use both of these things in tandem when making sounds, because you can create basically like one sound that can encapsulate both things. So, like for an example, let's say there's just like an elevator. You can have the gameplay feedback of I pressed the button. Maybe you're in like combat and everything's really loud. You want to hear like the player feedback of I pressed something. Maybe you hear like the elevator coming down and it's getting louder as it's coming closer to you. So there's like a little time based element to it. That's player feedback. And then also for the story side of things, like, do you hear chains? Does it feel creaky? Like what's the like the state of the storytelling of like what that elevator is. So using both of these things are pretty key and like integral for like making good sounds that kind of have like more depth to them, things that like tell a story and give you feedback. So, to preface most of this stuff, wanted to talk about specifically for mixing is this idea of like the cocktail effect, which if you've ever found yourself in like a large social gathering and you're having a conversation with someone and then you hear other conversations going on, you can kind of like hear a little bit of everything. But in terms of game audio, we kind of have like a similar idea. So like when you're in a large room and a bunch of people are talking, normally you can only really discern, let's say like three things at every moment. And so like our brains psychoacoustically, when you're in that big party setting, you can like kind of focus your attention on certain things and you'll be able to hear that a little better, and then focus something on there and you'll hear that a little better. But we don't really have that benefit of psychoacoustics in games because there's just a whole bunch of things that go on with like how sound enters your ear and interacts with your brain. So like really for games, it's almost like a bit flatter. Like in terms of like we don't have the ability to kind of do that. I would love to know why it's kind of like maybe more scientific on things, but with mixing, when it comes to your game, let's say, at every moment you want to hear three things. So where do you start with that? You can kind of think about that as like, you know, various degrees of like each moment in a game. So like, let's say you're in an exploration mode. You want to hear the ambiances, you want to hear all of that kind of stuff, the footsteps. And if you're loading up, let's say like a level with a whole bunch of things, categorically, how well can you hear like all the birds in the trees, all the footsteps, and then an explosion happens. That's going to be your start of like your combat. So you want to push everything out of the way because you don't need to worry about the birds in the trees or the wind that's kind of like peacefully going along. You need to focus on the most important details, which would be the combat. And then, yeah, similar to like cutscenes, what are just basically like what's the most important thing you want to hear, and then you want to like make your mix in tune with that. So, with that, we can get into some mixing. So, some of the ideas, actually, I'll come back to this later. So, with mixing, like I said before, where you have like different modes and like what's the most important thing in every portion of the game. You have your three main categorizations of sound. So that's sound effects, voice, music. And I'm going to pull up Wwise real quick. So sound effects, music, here, and then voice. These are the main three things, and then everything else you can start to break down into smaller categories. So the way that a bus essentially works is, let's say you have a sound, it's some player footsteps. You will want to assign almost basically like a pipeline forward to your output, which would be like your master bus. And so you have all these different categories of sounds. You player foley, which like maybe like your clothing, maybe some gear. You want to break these things out into, let's say, all of these sounds go into a player bus. All right. And I know I'm kind of going a little bit fast, but we're going to get into like the mixing part here. So all of these things kind of give you the tools to either like push things up, pull things down, depending on that idea of like what are the most important things you want to hear. So also, yeah, anyone, you're allowed to stop me at any point. I can kind of feel myself like rushing through some of these things. So if you need me to like take a pause, it's a lot of info at once. So
You're so good. Don't worry about it.
okay, cool. Whenever I talk about these things, like I'm so ingrained in it that I'm like, yeah, like the buses and like, you're
Yeah.
mixing and pulling things up and down.
it,
So
it sort of translates to music, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So really, what this like gets into is you have all of these um, independent, basically like levers that you're pulling. So like you can have something normal down, you can just kill it, so that way there's no sound going on over there. And the importance of these interactive mix moments is to say like yeah, with the example of we're exploring, everything's kind of base level normal, nothing crazy's going on, and then an explosion or like a gunshot happens. We can say, okay, we don't need the ambiences anymore because they're not important. Like they're nice, but the main focus of your game right now is, you know, the gameplay tells, the player feedback. So anything that doesn't need to be there is just going to add noise to the entire mix. And when everything's just really noisy, going back to the cocktail effect, you won't be able to hear, like you won't be able to like strategize smartly on what's going on. So this is kind of wise, but you can do this in any sort of middleware or game engine. It's just like it's the terminology. So there are these things called states, and basically what they are is in the game you can call, this the state to adjust all of these buses, these little levers, in order to hear the things that you want to hear. So if I had a state here that says, okay, we're in combat mode, we can take the ambiances and like I didn't set this up beforehand, but we take the ambiances, pull them down, they're out. Maybe even like player Foley, we don't really need that. Turn it down. Player footsteps, we don't quite need that. It's good information. Pull it down just a little bit. And maybe normally your, NPC footsteps were down, but because we're in combat, we want to hear them more. Pull them back up. So it's just this idea of like almost taking a telescope and being like combat. This is the main thing that I want to hear. Anything that's related to it, we want to make sure that it doesn't get buried in anything else because it's very easy for you to just be like putting sounds in and just saying like, yes, here's the sounds. This is what the game sounds like. And the more that you kind of like tweeze certain things up and down based on what's important, the better the player's going to be able to like understand things that are going on. And so like voice is a huge part of gameplay, like interact the strategy, sort of like know if you have NPCs that are in a room, that you want to understand exactly where they are, what kind of state they're in, and you can do similar things like we did on like the sound effects, the footsteps Foley, to voice as well. So I'm gonna say like all of these voices, this bus hat is for all of the enemies that's in a room. And because, maybe depending on like how your AI is going, you might have some that are in combat, others that are a little bit farther that are not in combat. Maybe they're playing their search VO, even though, you've got a room of just loud explosions, and then people in the next room are just kind of like just talking to themselves, having like little story moments. We don't need that. So combat, kill the search. End combat, bring it back up. And same with like, yeah, normal dialogue. And then so with this example of you're in combat, you want to make sure that the attack VO always stays up. So this is kind of like an elongated way of saying know what all your audio levers are and then tune that to whatever situation that you're in.
So I have a question.
Oh, yes.
First of all, what are you working in right now? Like what program?
So the program I'm working in currently, is Unreal and Wise on, this project that I'm on, but I've worked in vanilla Unreal, vanilla Unity. I haven't used Fmod yet, and some other like third party, like middleware things, and also proprietary. So yeah,
Interesting.
the main thing like that I kind of want to like make sure students know is that like the programs will change. If you bounce around from project to project, the programs are always going to change, most likely. There's some industry standards like Wise and Unreal are kind of like a main AAA industry standard, but you might find yourself with a project that like doesn't have funding for middleware, or like maybe the programmers are a little weary about it and they say like, oh, we just want to let us implement all the things that we want to do. Um, and so the programs themselves aren't as important as like the terminology or like the theory behind most of these things. Um, so it's kind of like just understanding, you know, the what, like the what am I doing when mixing a game, because all of that uh, is like it's the same idea no matter what you're doing, but like individually, each program might do something better or different. It just depends
I'm
on
curious,
each
how
program.
does that actually change your workflow whenever you're having to hop between different programs? Because obviously you understand the theory, but I can understand that actually progressing through what you need to get done can be different based from program to program. So do you feel like some programs actively slow you down based on others?
Um, yes, yes and no. There's kind of like this almost pendulum of uh like how complex is a program and like how simple is a program. So like I guess an example would be like with Wise, it's a very I'm blanking out on the word, but like um, it's really complex. You can do anything you want to it. You just kind of have to like know all the ins and outs of things. Um, and like because its usability is so broad, sometimes that could slow you down a little bit. Whereas inversely, I was working on what was it? The Witness way back when 2016 that was using like a proprietary engine where everything was pared down and you only had like the things that you needed. It had no other cruft. It would be like, yeah, we want to, do this feature system XYZ. And with Wise, they have features A through Z, but having a proprietary system is like you don't have to worry about, A through X. Here's everything. So it's just like, oh, there's everything. Whereas Wise is kind of like, all right, got to go into, these states, got to go into the parameters, make some new parameters. So it's it's kind of a give and take, usually depending on like the programmer that's on your team. Um, hmm, I don't know. I think it's kind of a really weird way to kind of like go around to say like I don't. It doesn't really matter. It's just kind of like what do you know and where are the gaps in your knowledge um, for things. Does that answer the question? Sorry, I might have just gone like all
You
the
are
way
so good.
around.
No, yeah, you definitely did. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So like theory's number one, um, and then how you execute the theory based on what program you're using is essentially just a Google search away. So that's kind of um, my stance on some of those things.
I'd really love sometime during this Zoom to kind of see like your basic process and like the typical things that you end up editing or changing inside of audio that you get.
Yeah. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
So the experience that I have with sound design is for film. I'm actually a film major. So like my experience so far has been like in Pro Tools and designing like, a little bit of ambiance, but like, Foley, we still do that in the film area.
Hmm.
But like when it comes to mixing specifically and determining your levels, I know that we have like basic knowledge of like, okay, ambiance should be like a little bit quieter,
Mm.
like, but like I would just, I guess, love to see in like your own game design space what you would say is like your typical process for like mixing
Yeah.
and balancing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I actually glad that's a good segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about. Oh, hold on. I might need to get out to go back to one thing. Um, yeah, which is sort of like we're gonna go to the start. So let's say you're in your DAW and you create a bed that's ambience for for your game. So the main thing with like game audio versus like film is because it's so procedural that like you have to be ready for anything you want, anything that like the game's going to throw at you. So something that we do whenever we create an asset, you want to export it loud. Not like you're not clipping it, it's nice within the range. And, let's say you're designing it to a backdrop of like a video of stuff that's in game, and the wind in the ambiences is really nice, and it's all the way down, just you kind of just feel it. When you go to export it, you want to export it loud, because you can always turn it down in a game and you can't always turn it up. And like when you start turning things up in a game, you start to kind of like run the risk of clipping in the game engine. So you want to start loud, bring it way down. And I have an example. So like here's something from The Witness. So all of these samples that like you'll be hearing in this were essentially as loud as like just noise almost, but you mix them down so that way if you ever need something to pop up through, you have that headroom to kind of like bring it back up. And so yeah, as you can hear, everything's kind of like this nice mixing well with each other.
That's actually really, really nice that you do it that way, because I know with like boosting gain and such on an audio track, that's just boosting the signal rather than the actual like audio inside of it. So having the audio already so high seems like a perfect way to avoid manipulating it and just degrading the quality. So that makes a lot of sense. Interesting.
Yeah, and like there's so many times when like we'll be making a sound for ambiences and we export it, but when we go in to make it, we're like, yeah, it's down minus 31. And, it just always like feels weird, but that's just so we have the ability to be like, okay, now you're in like a gameplay cinematic, and, let's bring it up so that way players really feel the wind in there. And so if you export it like at a low level and you get to that moment and you're like, oh, let's really make the player feel it, you can only go up 12, and you can do other things, but if your wind's sitting right here, and then you boost it up, you're gonna start clipping it. Oh, how do I go back one? Because I clicked. Where? Oh yeah. So that kind of goes to. I'm just gonna keep it right here just for ease. Kind of goes to. Did I want to get through this yet? No, not really.
Eric, so you're making those assets yourself? Like are you creating like the actual sounds that you're exporting? Or are you, and you mentioned sampling, is it?
It's a mix of both.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a really large, personal sound library of things that like I've recorded in the past. But a lot of things I'll get like, sound effect sample packs, or like there's other professionals in the field who like their whole job is to record sounds and then like edit them up. Which like I'll get back to that, and I'll show you all like kind of sound effects library thing. I'll be bringing that up real quick. I kind of forgot where I was going with that like wind example on. Oh yeah, like exporting. Oh, okay, Soundly. It's just gonna like chill here. So I guess when exporting, this is slightly tangential, but it was just something I wanted to like touch on. Every DAW that you get whenever you render a file has these certain things. And if you're, so yeah, this kind of goes into format. So if you're not using like middleware, a .ogg file format is going to be pretty lightweight. They're kind of smaller sizes. If you are using middleware, I mean, you can export it as a wave. Those are kind of more higher quality. And the bit depth and sample rate was something that I wanted to come across because I find a lot of people who are like kind of making games like to take sounds and be like, all right, let's pitch it way down. And that kind of runs into this thing called like bit depth and sample rate. If you have any questions about this, we can definitely like talk about it a little more. It's way more technical, but you kind of want your sample rate to be around like 4,800 hertz and then a bit depth of 24 bit. That's kind of like a pretty, it's higher resolution than, you know, like I think like CDs were 1640, you know, 44.1. But what that basically does is the sample rate, as you can see here, are basically just the points on the waveform that like record it. So the more points you have, the farther you can stretch it out. And so if you have like smaller points, you stretch it out, it's going to start to sound kind of, you know, artifacty, a little more digital. So that was just one little thought I had while going through these things. And then when you're also exporting, you have the option for mono or stereo. And usually, rule of thumb, mono is positional sounds. You place it in the game, and it's like right there. It's emitting from one source. Stereo is going to be a little more like environmental. For the example, like for a gunshot, you say like an NPC fires a gun. You want like the impulse to be mono so you can locate it, pinpoint it really easily. And then stereo could be like the tail reverberation of it if you've created those assets. And I think I'm going to just quickly go over sound libraries. So what I use is this thing called Soundly. There's a bunch of different other ones that you can utilize. And basically what it is a central repository for a lot of sounds. So I can like kind of show, make sure I'll kind of cut it off here. There's some NDA stuff on the other side. So I have like my own sound effect library, you know, it's personal one, commercial libraries, terabytes of sounds, so many things. And so when I bring things into my computer, I can say like, I want, you know, a bear growl, and it goes through all of the things and is like, sweet, here's, I mean, it's I guess a cartoony, yeah, there's a cartoony bear of like a human doing it. I can, you know, select certain aspects of it, bring it into my DAW. Would recommend if you're, you know, dealing with a lot of sounds that you want to try and like get in, or have been collecting a lot of sounds and you kind of don't really know where to turn.
That's really well organized too.
Oh
What I
yeah,
can
no,
see.
it saves my life
Yeah.
for so many times. Yeah, because they've got a lot of like descriptors that you can search by. You can say like even what like metal impact, but hollow and like reverberant. Let's see if this gives it. Okay, I mean, there, like hollow metal, reverberant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious, because of
Yeah.
how well organized this is and everything, how much time do you usually get to work on a project and actually be able to incorporate all these sound effects? Because it seems like you've set up a system to make it as efficient as possible, but I would really love to know how much time they actually give you.
Like to make, let's say like, you know, they want me to make a creature sound with all of these animations, like how long?
Yeah, I'm also curious how they pace out the structure of giving you assignments. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's you never know. You never know how long it's gonna be, and like you want to be as quick as possible without suffering from any sort of like, you know, degrade in quality that you
Yeah,
get.
of course.
I don't quite have an answer for that. Especially for like someone coming into it. Let's say your rate is like a little bit smaller because you don't have like your entry level you'll definitely have a longer time grace period if your employer is nice, to kind of like find all the things and kind of like get your feet wet and like
Yeah.
understand how you like do certain things.
So it's dynamic based on who you work with. It's you can't usually expect a certain amount of time.
Yeah, yeah. And like if
Okay.
you're working on like an indie project, that might not have a lot of funding, like it might be more like, no, no, just get something in quick and like just do the best you can. Whereas like maybe in AAA, it's like, here's, we're trying to explore what this monster sounds like. Take a week,
Yeah.
to experiment and like find the right thing. So yeah, it varies. You never know. And even varying on projects where they're like, hey, we're doing this monster. We want to explore how it sounds. You have a day.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, well, let me just get through all the things and just
So
show us
would
some
you say
sketches.
it's usually based on like the action or the creature rather than like the level? Like you would never get paced like, hey, finish this level's sound design by a certain date. It would be like, hey, finish the wind breeze in the background or like the specifics of the scene.
Yeah, yeah, it would be the specifics of the
Gotcha.
scene because, yeah, especially with games, like you can use that wind elsewhere. Like,
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
and like because making games is such a like iterative, like everyone's building as everyone's going, and so
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's maybe even less so like make us this scene. It's kind of like give us uh the different aspects of the scene and then like implement it. Um,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
really, really cool. Thank you.
Oh yeah. Let me see. Okay, yeah. Final thing I wanted to talk about for like mixing is finding your anchor of a sound. So the anchors, it's kind of what I'm just calling it, but they're like reliable sounds that understand, how they should be placed in the world, because it, everything's so dynamic. And so what this basically is like when you're implementing sounds, kind of understand where your volume level is at on your computer. Usually I'll like play another game and kind of be like, all right, we had some like, soft exploration moments, got into combat, it's like really high. And I find like a nice sweet spot of like, all right, the combat's really high. So this is going to be my limit. I'm not going to touch my audio interface. I'm not going to turn anything down. I'm just going to keep it right there. And then while you do that, you're implementing footsteps. And so you want footsteps to kind of be like a baseline low, and you don't change that. Obviously, if you're interactive mixing, that might change, but like normal gameplay, you're like, cool, I know where the footsteps are at. Implement a gunshot, you want it to be nice and loud, you put it there. And so now you have this like scale of like, all right, footsteps should be here. You put in wind, that should be below footsteps. Gunshot should be higher. And then a giant explosion happens. It's maxing everything out. That's going to be the highest. And then just kind of understand where everything is in relation to each other. So that way you can have kind of a dynamic, implementation of everything just from the get go. Because like sometimes, when you're just putting things in, you're like, all right, cool. I have, a high level footstep sound, put it in, and then you get into the game and everyone's like shooting some guns, and then the players like making some footsteps, and it's just as loud as the guns, and you're like, no, 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 like know where everything should kind of sit. All right. Wow. 39 minutes. Thank you for all the questions, by the way. I'd be either blowing through this without any kind of context, but if you'll allow me, I'm going to switch to the non-technical audio side, which is kind of my favorite part of being a sound designer and like overseeing all audio, which is the storytelling. So basically, the what, the where, the why, the how, all of those ideas. Um, so this kind of pertains to like when you're creating sounds. When you're creating sounds, you kind of want to understand the why, the what, the how. Um, and so like what this kind of does is gives your sound like depth, and you want to at least try to answer one of these questions. So the why being like the central event or problem, like what's kind of the motivation of the sound, kind of like in terms of that, elevator example before, like the why of an elevator coming down is kind of like you want to hear it, you want to understand like what are the inner workings, which I guess that kind of goes a little more into, yeah, like the what. All right, rewind. The what? So it's kind of like what's driving that elevator sound. Is it like old? Is it decrepit? Is it nice? Are we in a sci-fi game? So is it like more pneumatic, like air pressure? Is it like magnets? Just try and like don't just make a sound for the sake of making a sound. Obviously, if you don't have a lot of time to do it, that's fine. But like the real depth and like the art of sound design kind of comes from these questions. And the more questions you can answer, the more depth it gives your sounds, which I've said depth a lot already, but it's basically like, what is the meaning behind certain things and how far down can you go through those meanings to evoke like kind of a more substantial ideation on something as simple as an elevator coming down. And so before I kind of talked about there's two different ideas of like audio storytelling, the narrative and then the emotional. So narrative storytelling, it's kind of a way to heighten your game's lore almost with audio, and emphasizes the details of the story. I posted the witness thing earlier, but I'm going to come back to it because there's a lot of audio storytelling just in this. So like you see this image of trees, what do you normally think of? You think of like the wind kind of coming through, you think of some birds, it's all the flora and fauna of things. But when you start to look at it with more audio storytelling, the story of the witness of like the island here is that it's uninhabited. It's like there's no animals. It's just you. You're the only thing that's in this world. And so you can use that to inform what things you wanted to hear. And so like I was just a technical implementer on the witness. So like all of these aren't my ideas. I was just like helping implement these things. But their main idea of what they wanted to do was like no birds, no insects, nothing that's alive. And it just kind of it helps drive the story of you're alone on this island. Because normally you'd be like, yeah, like there's birds, there's things. But to remove that gives the narrative a bigger chance to kind of like tell its own story. And you can also do a similar thing. I have an example from Annihilation, which is like scary creature. Okay, what does a scary creature sound like? Maybe it like roars. You can mix in some like other weird animals. Like we just want it to be scary. But the story of this creature is that I don't know if anyone's seen Annihilation before, but essentially they're like mimics, and so they kind of like they try to oh, it's been so long since I've seen it, I'm kind of fumbling over it, but it's essentially like they're eating the other people and then like they become part of them. And so when you're normally like, okay, cool, creepy, scary, give a roar, they decided to go with when it opens its mouth, it's a human. And so even with just that can give your like sounds way more depth of like why did the creepy bear open its mouth and I heard someone yelling help? Like it's because they're mimicking human speech and trying to do that. So it's a fun way to kind of just like heighten everything, give it more depth, kind of like let the players be like, why did I hear that? And then let them come up with ideas for themselves. And yeah, the next part I have right here, which is like, play, like have fun. You can make stories even if there's not like a set thing, like even if it's just a vibe. if you have the creative, I guess like sign off, if the creative director's like, sure, like make something, tell me a fun story, give it some more depth to it. You can kind of like implement certain things, make up stories yourself that kind of help the overall narrative of things. And the example I have here is from an indie game I worked on a little bit ago, where it was a small team. It was like me, the developer, some other people, and we get to this moment that's kind of like at the very like the climax of the game, and you're in this like creepy house of this person that's kind of been haunting you, and we wanted to just let the player feel uneasy. It's a little bit of like in between worlds sort of thing. And so I was kind of like, all right, let me go through this house and find different ways that like I can augment the story. And so we have like the scene here where we're in this house, and it's kind of hard to hear. Okay, basically, I went with a story of like, okay, we're in the belly of the beast, and so I used that to kind of be playing like hisses and like some rattling, just some other things to kind of like accentuate these like weird scaly walls, and just to kind of be like, no, this house doesn't just sound like a house. It sounds like reptiles, insects. And then you go up to this other area where narratively it's kind of like where your grandfather is kind of like stored, and instead of going kind of like more horror, I'm like, well, it's you're finding your grandfather at the very end of this game, and this is where he's being held, so why not evoke some sort of sense of like nostalgia and like peace. And so there's water going around. You can hear like a grandpa like crying, and then even going a little farther, you're in a space where there's like random characters. Yeah, it's kind of hard to hear, but like basically they're like whispering around you. And so all of this to say is like you can take an area that's like really just normal and standard, and you can heighten it all with audio for narrative purposes. And so just a little jargon, which is like realism, hyperrealism. It's a very common thing in sound design, where realism is, things that are actually in the world, the ways that like it sounds right. You pick up a glass of water, you put it down, and it sounds perfect right there. There's a tool, or there's a thing that we call like hyperrealism, which is kind of like this augmentation of sounds that like kind of speak to the heightened sense of emotion. Oh gosh, I only have 10 minutes left. I'm gonna get through these. Okay. Goodness, we've been having fun. So I'm gonna get over to emotional storytelling. So what is narrative and what is emotional storytelling? The narrative is like kind of the depth of information that you have. The emotional is the manipulation of like the player's emotion, how they should feel. And one thing that kind of comes to mind with this is this old technique that we had in film, which is called the Kuleshov effect. And that's basically taking two ideas, putting them, juxtaposing them against one another. And so in this, you have a picture of food, and then you have a picture of a man. All right, what does that tell you about the man? It tells you that he's hungry. And then same shot of the man, but before that, we have picture of, oh wow, yeah, it's a dead child. Okay, so picture of a dead child, same picture of a man. The picture hasn't changed, but the narrative has changed, that now this man is sad. So that's kind of like the basis of the idea of like a montage. And you can use this idea to kind of help inform your storytelling. And let me bring this over. And so here's this example I put together that's essentially just a train ride. Cool. You know, here's the audio. It's literally just the train. And so you can take, with this, it's music, and manipulate the player's emotion based on how you want them to feel. So, little Christmas tunes. So here, you're kind of like, oh, sweet. It's very chill, peaceful, serene. Christmas time, you know? Like, it's just a beautiful train ride through. You can also completely flip that. We have the same shots that we're doing, the same, even if this is in a game, the same lead up to something, but by just changing one aspect of what you're hearing, it completely just throws the player into a different head state. So that has a lot to do with the emotional storytelling. And I think I had another. Oh, did I write down the perspective? Okay, yeah. So the final thing on emotional storytelling is this thing that I call like focal zoom. I don't know if there's an actual term for this, but I use it a lot, so I just call it my own thing. But essentially, it's the relationship between the player and the media within relation to like immersion. So think of it kind of like, you have a screen and like how close are you like focusing on that? So when you have quiet details, things that are like intimate, physical, the Foley, like you're hearing the person, shuffle their papers, or like, tiny little details, little footprint, like footsteps that are kind of going along. You're very like immersed inside this world that you're in. So everything's like very close and you're kind of like leaning in, and then contrast that with like a big emotional moment. So things that are like really grand kind of pulls you out the scene and just lets you witness the whole thing, kind of emotionally. So it's no longer like I'm inhabiting this physical space to I'm sitting back. It's kind of like if you sit on a hill and like watch the sunset, like everything is just very, very grand. And a good, oh, I didn't have that up. Where is it? Oh, I'm blanking out on it. Oh, I thought I had it up. But essentially, you can use this kind of like zoom, this focal zoom, to like manipulate the player in order of like thinking, feeling things differently. So here's a separate example, but also very tied from the old Final Fantasy VII. Here's basically just like some combat. You got music, sound effects, UI. It's very big. It's grandiose, but this is like kind of the default. And so what you can do is subvert some of those expectations, which, quick spoilers for Final Fantasy VII. This is the scene after Cover Your Ears, Aerith dies. And so you go into this big boss battle, and this actually came up via a bug while I was playing once, and where the sound effects were muted, like all the UI was muted, and all that was left was just the music. And I was like, this is such a powerful tool, because normally you're hearing like all right, all this feedback, and then for an extremely emotional moment, if you take away elements, you get into combat. And so like if everything's silent and you just hear this like really heart-wrenching theme, it kind of makes you be like, this is such a, like, why am I just hearing the music? You kind of go into like the player's head of like, well, none of this combat stuff matters. It's about the story. of the loss of one of our party members. And so that's kind of like the idea of like stepping back and being more grandiose with it. Uh, yeah. And then, so like a final thing that I have here, which is this rule of six from this. He's kind of like an audio guy, but mainly like a film editor. And it's a really interesting breakdown of like what should each moment, like what should be driving each moment. And he argues that 51% of like what you want to be hearing, seeing, interacting with should be driven from emotion first, and then secondarily 23% story, and then rhythm. This is kind of a little bit more film term because like 3D space, 2D plane, eye trace, that's like on a static screen, but it's still, we still utilize it in like game audio a lot because the most impactful thing that you can be getting out of a game's soundscape is what's the emotion and what's the story. So like go through those two things initially, and usually what's kind of like hard to understand is like, well, shouldn't the story be like a big thing? Yes, it is, but it's not as impactful as like what's the emotion that you want to evoke from it. So that's audio storytelling in a nutshell. I definitely went over time, but does anyone have questions or I don't know, things they want to like talk about?
I mean, I just want to say that after hearing what you were talking about of implementing storytelling, sorry, making the sound tell the story, I just want to say that I really appreciate that because right now I'm making a game for my senior project and I'm trying to invoke as much feeling as I can within the users, specifically for when they hurt our character or when they're about to enter in a new area. The sound effects that I put in can really change the tide of that. So I just want to say thank you for teaching me more about that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And it's, yeah, like I said before, it's the emotional impact is like the main thing you want to like really hit over the head. And there's many ways to do it. And you just kind of want to like look inwardly and be like, what does the story actually want them to like, how does the story uh influence the things that I want them to hear, whether it's like music or if it's like a sound. Um, yeah, start flexing those storytelling muscles because it's not just for the narrative people, it's also for everyone else in the entire like crew that makes a game.
I'm curious. Lily, you go first.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I'm curious. Do you often play off things like nostalgia to get a better feeling from the player? Like, say in Minecraft, if you accidentally punch a wolf or something, you immediately hear that sound and you feel absolutely terrible, like the worst person on the planet. And I'm curious if you play off of things like that to make the person feel a certain way, maybe if they don't even realize that that's what's triggering their emotion.
Uh, yeah, so that's a good one. I would argue that it's not quite nostalgia because like the nostalgia comes after something has worked.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, and so like what you want to get is that like, yeah, you punch a wall and you're like, oh, like that sounded bad, and to let that kind of inform your memory of like the experience of it,
Yeah.
which then
And
goes to, yeah, like, you come back to Minecraft like 20 years later, then you hit that and you're like, oh my God, there's so much like there's so much history to that like emotional
yeah.
sound.
And that
Yeah.
goes into the same thing as like the satisfaction of a hit marker, like in a shooting game or something. Whenever you like land that headshot, there's a sound that comes with it that immediately gives you that satisfaction. How do you go about developing that kind of sound?
Um, oh gosh, I mean, there's a lot of like word association
Yeah.
that kind of goes into it, but yeah, usually one of the main words for something especially like that is like reward. So you know, I think I'm thinking of, I don't know, maybe is it one of the, oh, I forget what game, but like there's some games when like if you land a headshot, like you hear an impact, and then maybe you hear a little extra bit of like, say, like a crunch, a little bit of gore, and then like a ping, like
Yeah, we'll get.
almost an,
I like the bell sound for sure. I do
yeah,
get
like
that a lot.
literally just like something that's like ding ding, like
Yeah,
just having that like association of like what's a reward, like I don't know, a slot machine
yeah, like a
rumbling,
slot
like
machine
ding
sound.
ding, and
That's
you're like,
great.
oh yeah, just to give the player like dopamine. um
Yeah.
yeah, so that also goes in a lot. So yeah, word association on like the emotional equivalent of like what should the player be feeling.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question was about you bringing in like music into the group, and I just wanted to hear like, since you said that like typically the music that you bring in is from other people,
Mhm.
are there any like, I guess, common issues that you run into when you're trying to blend like the music with the ambiance or anything like that? Or like, is there anything that you have like noticed taking in music that you would like composers to know to kind of make it easier on you or something like that?
um yeah, sparing like technical things, usually like
You can tell me about the technical things.
yeah, well, the technical things just kind of get bogged down in like the technicalities, hence technical.
Honestly,
But like,
if I
there's
could
so many
piggyback
different
off that a
ways.
little bit,
Oh,
that's just like with dialogue and scoring, how like sometimes if the dialogue's in like a lower register, you have to bring the score instrumentation higher and you have to like play on the violins and such to like give better, like, I guess, equalizing whenever you're using like the EQ spectrum to like cover those higher frequencies while the sound design's covering the lower frequencies. Do you kind of find that balance?
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah,
you do kind of like you find that balance. But I think ultimately going back to Layla, your question,
mhm.
I think it's just kind of like open feedback. Like, if you're a composer and you put something in a game, and like let's say you have an audio director who's kind of like love it. However, maybe we're going to be having a lot of like, low end sounds because it's a creepy moment. Like, we might want to take up this lower register. So, can you rework it so that way you stay in a higher register? Or
Yeah,
inversely, like, if the composer's like, hey, look, this is, um, you know, a huge, grandiose moment, like the final battle of something. Like, I just want to like check in with y'all to be like, are you cool with music, like keeping like the main focus, and then
yeah,
yeah, to
That's
go back to like
amazing.
yeah, interactive
Yeah.
mixing to kind of be like, is it cool? And like usually if like they're a good audio director, they're like, oh yeah, no, we wanted you to like do that, like that's the whole vibe. And then for them to like, yeah, either like, just let the composers like do what they want, but without trying to kind of like step on too many toes to
Yeah.
be like,
right. Because you're all
yeah,
telling that story
yeah,
together in their own way.
constructive feedback's gonna be the best way to go. And like, even if you get constructive feedback that's like, hey, maybe we don't want to do the lower things, and maybe you're like, I'm really passionate about that, like just keep conversation going. And then
Mhm.
because like all of these, as a creative art, like it's all about the collaboration, and like you might have a good idea, but someone might have a better idea. Um, but you don't know about that unless you kind of like give that culture to letting people like express their things. And then the role as the audio director would be like, these are all great ideas, but I think we should be going for this one, and then have everyone kind of like coalesce around it.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I'm
Thank
really
you
glad it's
so
like
much.
a community decision. It's not just one person making that call to organize it, because I feel like that dialogue is really, really important.
Yeah, yeah. And like that's just like, depending on the culture of the company that you're at,
Yeah.
hopefully is good. And sometimes it is a little more dogmatic, and that's
Yeah.
fine too. But the open dialogue ones are definitely really fun to work with.
Have you ever had that issue with too many chefs in the kitchen or too many fingers in the pie and having a lot of people kind of changing the direction of what you were originally intending and not agreeing with it?
Yeah, from time to time, like it'll come up. Maybe not so much too many chefs. Trying to think. Yeah, not so much like too many chefs, but more. Mm, yeah, I mean that it's just every company is going to be slightly different, and you just kind of have to like be a, I don't know, a team player and like know your limit on on certain things, and also just like try to help create that environment that's like good open conversations. And if the director is like, no, like we know exactly what you want, then you can either be like, well, I don't like this and I'm out, or you can be like, all right, let me know what to do and let me know how to help you, kind of thing. So,
Gotcha. Thank you.
well, this has been fun. Oh yeah, one final I guess plug. I'm just gonna do a shameless plug. Um Slightly unrelated to game audio things, but definitely related to kind of like using games as like narrative storytelling elements. So I run an experimental video game gallery here in Atlanta, that honestly would be fantastic for so many people to like check out, especially as like as students. Um, so I run this thing. It's called Avant Beetle, and it's an experimental games. And um, the thing that I always take stuff from the more experimental games and try to like see what is cool and like what works. Um, and so there's these exhibitions that I put on, um, maybe like 3 times a year. Would love for y'all to like come out to it. Um, a plethora of ideas that you can like take from those things. Because like I said, I'll be playing some like weird wild game, and like they do certain thing like in the audio space that like inspires me to do something different, and I'm like, wow, that was like really cool and like really experimental, and like just leaves the audience kind of being like, why did I hear that thing? So like I can post it in like the chat, but putting together another show in April. Would love to have y'all out. Um, it's such a great like almost bank of like ideas that people are doing in the video game scene that aren't quite like not AAA, not even indie, but like micro indie. It's almost like a punk show that you go to where people are just like trying out all these new ideas. So you can get a lot of inspiration from those things.